Good morning, good morning, good morning. What's up, Heldy? How are you today? Welcome in, everybody. Thursday edition of the show. Should be a fun one. We're going to have a lengthier pre-show than normal today here on the podcast because we need to agree on these championship tiers ahead of the show starting. And so I have them all written down here in a document for us, but we need to agree on them before we start the show. So probably have a little bit of a lengthier pre-show here today while we debate these tiers and make sure that we feel comfortable with where they stand before we get into the show. But I've got all the tiers written out. I've got all the teams filed into these respective tiers, what they're called, why they're a little bit of a descriptor. And so we'll get into that here in just a little second. But here in just a second, I've got a couple more things I got to do before the start of the show. So welcome in, everybody. Give me just a few minutes and we will be ready to go. Morning, Bailey. How are you today? All right, we are good to go. I've got everything all set up here. Just let me check one quick thing first. All right, all good here. So we'll transition into this screen. We're not starting the podcast recording yet because we do have some pre-show stuff that we need to get into. And so for today's show, we're looking at championship life cycles in the National Football League, and we're tiering all of these teams out, and we're figuring out what bucket we want to put them in ahead of the 2023 season. And I've got 5 buckets. I have 5 buckets that we have created for the show today. But before we get into the show and debate where the teams fall into the buckets, we got to make sure we have the right buckets. So here's what we have so far for the 5 tiers. I will share them with you guys, and you tell me if you agree, disagree, if we want to add a 6th, change the phrasing, whatever the case may be. So we've got our championship window, their next 1 to 2 years, the all-in bucket. Okay, that's our first bucket. Our second bucket, championship window, the next 1 to 5 years. We describe these teams as firm contenders. So teams that haven't put all their chips in the middle. These are not teams that have, completely mortgaged the future to try to win now. These are teams that have a nice balance that they can win right now, but they've got some long-term sustainability as well. So we've got that as our second bucket. Our third bucket, our championship window opening within the next 2 to 4 years. We call these the teams that are on the rise. Our fourth bucket, the championship window, this one we describe as at a turning point, meaning these championship windows could open relatively soon, but they could also need a complete reset. They are kind of at an inflection point, a turning point in their franchise where they're at the fork in the road, and they got to choose which direction they want to go in. So we have that bucket. And we have our last bucket, the championship window, the likely 3 to 4 plus years away bucket, which we describe as the opening stage of a rebuild. So those are the 5 buckets, the 5 tiers, the 5 championship windows that I want to put all these teams in. So now, here we are in this very lengthy pre-show. I ask you guys, do we feel comfortable with those tiers? Do we feel comfortable with using those as the descriptors? Is there something that we haven't really kind of touched on? Is there something that we're missing? I try to make this as all-encompassing as possible so that we have buckets that describe everything. Bailey says, what is the fourth bucket again? That bucket is at a turning point, meaning that these teams' championship windows could potentially open right away, or they could need a reset, which is different from the teams that are on the rise and we see their championship window opening in a couple of years if they continue on the path that they're on. These are teams that they could go one way and they could very quickly move into on the rise and move into firm contender, but they also could very easily, flip of a coin, be going in the other direction as well. So we've got all in, championship window, open, firm contender, the approaching the window within the next couple of years, the turning point, and then the opening stage of the rebuild. Yes, Bailey, kind of the way that you have it described is how I would describe the 5 buckets. So that's what we've got. That's our 5 descriptors for these buckets. with the all-in distinction being that they need to win in the next year or two before it becomes way more difficult. Yes, if they do not win within the next 2 years, they very quickly probably go into the turning point category very, very quickly. That's the idea. And the all-in bucket's got a lot of teams in it, I think. It's got one, right now it's got 1, 2, 3, it's got 6 teams that I've described as all-in for the next 1 to 2 seasons. So if we feel comfortable with those buckets, I can press record, we can start the show, and I can re-explain these buckets. But I wanted to make sure we had the right buckets. I didn't want us to get into the show, I explain the buckets, and then we go on a complete tangent for 10, 15 minutes redefining the buckets. I'm not sure that's a really great listen for the podcast audience. For you guys where we can interact and banter back and forth and have these conversations, it's fine. For the podcast audience, I kind of wanted a streamlined, this is what we've agreed on, this is what we're doing, and then we just get into where the teams sit. And so kind of wanted to have a little bit of a lengthier pre-show here today so that we can have that conversation and decide if these are the 5 buckets that we want to have. It doesn't appear that there's any real concern about the buckets, and we feel like we've got everything encompassed the way that we want, which is okay. And I will tell you, this is the third iteration of the list. I had a different version earlier this morning that didn't describe the championship windows in the correct way, and so then I kind of redefined it and got to this conclusion. So it's good to see that we think this is the right way to go. So with that being said, let's jump into it. Let's get this show on the road. I'll press the record button for the podcast audience so we can get this show started. So let's do it. And welcome in to the Thursday edition of the TDN Daily podcast. Chris Schubert back with you here once again on the show. Hope you are all having a fantastic start to your Thursday. We've got a fun one, another one in store for you here today on the show. Championship life cycles. Where do all 32 teams sit in their championship life cycle ahead of the 2023 season? And I think my favorite part of doing something like this is this allows us to very easily identify the teams that we think are all in for this year, the teams that we think are using 2023 as a building block, teams that are at a turning point in 2023, and it gives us kind of an all-encompassing look of what these teams might look like in 2023 and where their future holds. And so it's a lot of fun. We've ranked all 32 teams, and I will tell you that if you like to see kind of the nuance, you kind of like to see some of the behind the scenes of the podcast, I highly recommend today's video version of the show, because before I pressed record for the podcast audience, we had a pretty lengthy pre-show, one of the longer pre-shows that we've done here on the TDN Daily podcast, where we finalized the tiers. I didn't want to come into this show and read out the tiers that I had, and there'd be some disagreement among the live YouTube chat of what the tiers meant, what the tiers should say. I didn't want us to sidebar a little bit. So we had a pretty lengthy pre-show to narrow down what these tiers were going to look like. I presented the way that I had it structured. The live YouTube chat felt pretty good about it, and so we are here ready to go. And so now I'm going to read you these 5 tiers and what each tier means, and then we are going to get into putting the teams in the tiers. I've already done it. We're going to I'll share my list. We'll have some debates among the chat. Maybe we'll make some movement as we go. We've got the interim producer of the show, Bailey, is here because I don't have my multiple monitor setup. So Bailey is acting as the de facto producer here of the show because I don't have the multiple monitors. So he will keep track in real time for us what is going on here. But here are the 5 tiers. Here are the 5 buckets that we have. We have the championship window all in, meaning these teams have put everything in the middle. They've pushed all their chips in the middle to win in either the next 1 or 2 seasons. And beyond those next 1 or 2 seasons, it might become incredibly difficult or more difficult than it is in this current window for them to win. Whether it's because of a bloated roster with a lot of money on it, whether it's an aging quarterback who's going to be leaving at the end of those couple of seasons. There are a lot of different parameters. If maybe a quarterback's new deal kicks in and it's got a lot more money associated with it, where this is kind of their window, where if they don't win within the next 1 or 2 years, it is going to become more difficult down the road. So that's bucket number 1. Bucket number 2 is we've described this as a firm contender bucket, meaning the championship window completely open. The next 1 to 5 years, we view this team as they could win it this year, they could win it 3 years down the road, they can win it 5 years down the road. They are put together in a way that they are not mortgaging their long-term future for some short-term success. They have a nice balance going on their roster. Bucket number 3, we have the teams that are approaching the window, approaching that firm contender window. I would refer to these teams as on the rise, meaning within the next maybe 2 to 4 seasons, we could see that championship window fully opening and that they will be in that firm contender conversation. Our 4th bucket, we've described this as at a turning point, meaning these are teams that are at a fork in the road with their franchise, and they could really, truly go one of 2 ways. We could sit here and make the case on this show today that this team is close to being on the rise, and that by the end of the season, we could consider them a team that is on the rise. But we could also just as equally see if things don't go well in 2023, that this team could need a reset and could have to take a step backwards. So this is going to be the biggest bucket that we have. Just a little bit of a spoiler. This is the bucket that has the most teams because I think there are a lot of teams that we feel, at least I feel, that are at this inflection point. And then our last bucket, the fifth bucket, the championship window, likely 3 to 4 plus years away. This is what you would describe as you're at the opening stages of a rebuild. Whether you've admitted it or not, you are at the opening stages of the rebuild. So just to recap, we've got the all-in bucket, the fully open window bucket, the approaching the window on the rise bucket, the turning point bucket, and the opening stages of a rebuild bucket. Those are the 5 buckets that we are going to put these teams, these 32 teams in here on the show today. And I'll ask the live YouTube chat, which bucket would you like to start with? Would you like us to go from the teams that we think, or at least I think, have all their chips in the middle and they're all in for 2023? Or do you want to work for the other end of the spectrum and discuss the teams that are the furthest away we think that are in the opening stages of the rebuild, the 3 to 4 years away from being in their championship window? I see a lot of people in the chat wanting to discuss the all-in bucket first. Start at the top. Okay, and that's exactly what we will do. And I will tell you, I have 6 teams in here for this bucket, and there's 1 or 2 that I would be willing to move into the firm contender bucket if we wanted to have the conversation. So I've got 6 teams that I would classify as the next 1 to 2 years. This is their championship window. They're all in, and if they do not win within these next 1 to 2 years, it could get very, very scary for those teams, and they could very quickly find themselves towards the bottom of the list. And I think the easiest team, I'll get them out of the way here first so we don't spend too much time on them, is the New York Jets. Team that's pushed all in with Aaron Rodgers, whether it's for just this season, whether it's for the next 2 seasons. I don't see Aaron Rodgers being there for longer than 2 seasons. Potentially, they can convince him of a third. I think that's probably very unlikely. And so when you put all your chips in the middle, you trade the capital that they traded, you have a quarterback that's about to be 40 years old, and you've put all your chips in the middle to try to win with this roster, with this guy as your quarterback, you have done exactly what we would describe when saying that a team has gone all in for the next couple of seasons. So I think they're the poster child for this tier. But they're not the only team, I think, in the AFC East that we would describe in this tier. And this is not because that they have gone all in on an aging quarterback and they probably have a limited runway. I just look at this team and I wonder how many years you can continue to run back the same team with a quarterback who is starting to get more and more expensive as the years go on. And I know you just gave the GM and I know you just gave the head coach a contract extension, but I don't know how you can't look at the AFC East and tell me that Buffalo is not all in and that 2 years from now, this team might look vastly different than it does now, and it could absolutely move them further down this bucket. The AFC East and the AFC at large is getting a lot better behind them, and it feels like they have a window here where they absolutely have to make it work with this aging roster that they've put together with a lot of veteran players before maybe Stephon Diggs doesn't want to be there anymore. How many more years in the tank do you have of Von Miller so that you have a good pass rush? There's a lot of question marks outside of Josh Allen on this team because they are an older team. And so I have Buffalo in this group as well. I kind of gave away another team that I have in this bucket as well, and that's Baltimore. Because I don't know if they don't win within the next 1 to 2 seasons. They just signed Lamar. They signed Odell Beckham Jr. I don't know if they're going to be able to sustain this with that contract for Lamar and build a good team around him in a division that is getting better. Cincinnati's still going to be there. Cincinnati is in one of the buckets. They're not going away anytime soon. Cleveland is a team that's also kind of in a similar mold. I have Cleveland also in this bucket as well in the next 1 to 2 years, all in because of what the cap ramifications are of Deshaun Watson's extension there in Cleveland. Starting next year, that cap explodes. And so they need to be in this list because I'm not sure if they don't win within the next 1 to 2 seasons, if they're going to be able to put the correct team around Deshaun Watson there in Cleveland. And then I've got 2 others in here. And I see that there has been some conversation about putting the Broncos in the all-in bucket. Yeah, I don't know, guys. I don't have them there. I have them in a different bucket. I understand the argument. I understand that if it doesn't work within the next 1 to 2 years, that they are probably out of sorts. But to me, and I'll give it away here, I have them in the turning point bucket because I think 2023 is truly a turning point. Because I think if it works this year, they're probably in the firm contender with Sean Payton, with Russell Wilson, if they turn it around this year and they play better. But if they don't, they're going to need a reset. And they can turn it around this year and not win a championship. And so that was kind of the differentiating factor for me. But we'll put a pin in them and we'll have that conversation a little bit later. The other two teams I have in this bucket are the Miami Dolphins and the New Orleans Saints. The Saints, I don't think it needs to be said here on this show what the Saints do year in and year out with the cap, how they maneuver things around and restructure contracts and kick the can down the road and move the money around. And they just signed Derek Carr to a big contract, and they are constantly kind of flirting with the edge of needing to press the reset button and doing a rebuild, but they never actually do it. So they always constantly kind of retool and reshape their roster and really often put themselves in a position where if it doesn't work this year, then there's another big name that's going to leave their team the following season. And over time, it's been the law of diminishing returns, where each year they've gotten kind of worse and worse. And so to me, if Derek Carr doesn't come in there and give them some stable quarterback play, and they don't turn things around, I think you're going to look at 2023 as a point where they've got this year and next year to kind of win with Derek Carr, or else some of these bigger names that are around Derek Carr are going to be left behind, and they'll be playing for new teams next season or 2-3 years down the road, and you'll have a Saints team that will look vastly different than it does right now, and this Saints team looks vastly different than it does 2 or 3 years ago. Taylor B says, that's fair, but why couldn't you say that about the Browns? It's fair, and I think the Browns and Broncos are kind of tied similarly in that regard, and so we can have that conversation once we're done. And the last thing that I have in this list is the Miami Dolphins, and here's why. They haven't really made a full decision long-term on Tua, but once they do, that contract is going to kick in, and it's going to be at a large amount of money. And they've got a lot of other players that are on this team. They've got Tyreek Hill. They're going to have to pay Jalen Waddle here pretty soon. They've got Jalen Phillips. They've got Javon Holland. They've got a lot of players that are very, very important to their success, and they have to 100% build around that core. But they're also going to have to pay Tua. And if they pay Tua, then some of that core might not be able to stick around, and they might really push themselves into a tough championship window. And so for me, these next 1 to 2 years are really, really important for them. Bailey says, agree. I think the Dolphins are all in, have to make a decision on Tua this year. The team I am the least convinced is all in is the Bills in that group. You can make the case. Dolphins feel weird to put in all in. I mean, hell, I just don't see how. If you're not going to put them in the all in bucket, they kind of have to go into the, this is going to be weird to say, but then they have to kind of go into the on the rise bucket, because I don't know if they're a firm contender yet, because they don't have the long-term situation with Tua figured out. Could the Rams still be in the all in bucket? They don't feel like they're rebuilding yet. Just because they're not rebuilding like publicly doesn't mean I don't think they're rebuilding. Doesn't mean I don't think they're in the opening stages of a rebuild. And part of the opening stages of the rebuild are the 1 to 2 seasons right before the rebuild, when you don't think you're in a rebuild, but things start to deteriorate pretty quickly. And so that's just a little bit of a spoiler as to where I have the Los Angeles Rams here in a little bit. And so, okay, so I think the teams that we need to circle back on are, if we want to keep the Browns in this tier, do we also add the Broncos into this tier? And then do we want to move the Bills out of this tier? I think those are the two conversations that we have from this bucket. Now we'll get into the second tier, which is our championship window the next 1 to 5 years, the firm contender window completely open. Here's what I've got for this. Does everybody agree that the Kansas City Chiefs should be in the firm contender tier? Is everybody okay with that? The defending Super Bowl champs who have the best quarterback on the planet, that it doesn't matter that he's making a ton of money. They find a way to tool a roster because they have one of the greatest head coach quarterback combos of all time. Are we okay with putting the Chiefs in the firm contender? I know it's a hot take. I just want to make sure that it checks all the boxes for you guys before we move on to what I think is the next easy thing that we can do here, which is put the Philadelphia Eagles, defending NFC champs. They've got Jalen Hurts long-term. They've got a very nice roster of young players. They seem to draft really well. They've got a nice long window here. And they might quickly down the road, as this Jalen Hurts contract continues to escalate and more and more money, maybe these draft picks don't pan out the way that we think they are, they will slowly transition into the all-in bucket at some point. But for right now, they're good. I think the third easiest team to put in this bucket would be the Cincinnati Bengals. Taylor B just mentioned. Is everybody okay with putting Joe Burrow and that squad into this bucket as well? Is everybody okay with that? Is everybody fine with that? To put the Chiefs, Eagles, and Bengals in there? Is that fine? I know it's too hot takey for you here on a Thursday, but that's what we're going to do. I've got two other teams in this bucket. One of which I think you guys are going to disagree. You might disagree with both of them. But I think one you guys are going to strongly disagree with, and the other, I think you'll understand the rationale. I have down here as a firm contender, their championship window is the next 1 to 5 years. And this is really, really dependent on whether or not they can figure out the quarterback situation. But they have proven that they don't really need to figure this out to be in the mix. I have the San Francisco 49ers here because I don't know what other bucket describes them, to be honest with you guys. They're not a team that's on the rise. I don't think they're a team that's at a turning point because even if they don't figure out the quarterback situation, I think the rest of the roster is way too good to facilitate a reset. And they're not in the opening stages of a rebuild. And so if you maybe wanted to put them in the all-in bucket, I can understand. But to me, this is the only bucket that truly fits with what they're currently doing and how I feel they're currently operating. Do I love it? No. But I don't know if there's another bucket that they really, truly fit in. And this is the closest match. And so this is where they go. And then the other team that fits this bucket for me is the Dallas Cowboys. Again, you maybe want to try to discuss them as a team that's all in. But other than that, I don't know if there's another bucket that really, truly fits them. Are they a team that's on the rise? I don't think so. Maybe they're a team that's at a turning point. They're certainly not in the opening stages of a rebuild. So I think those are the two buckets. And back to the 49ers really quickly. Taylor B says, agreed, but they might be all in because I don't know how much longer this method without a quarterback will work. And Taylor B, that's kind of the justification here, right? Is the all-in thing is you've got the next 1 to 2 years to win a championship or else it could completely fall off the cliff. With the firm contender window, we give you a little bit of a longer runway, the next 1 to 5 years. I think San Francisco can be competitive over the next 3 seasons while they try to figure out the quarterback situation. But 5+ years from now, if they're still doing this, I don't know if it'll work. And so maybe that's me having some semantics, but I just feel like they might be able to get away with this a little bit longer than the all-in bucket. And so this is where they kind of have to settle for me. Bailey says, Cowboys are correct in this bucket. Jerry isn't spending as much cash as he would if they were all in. I think that's fair too, right? Is if we were in the all-in bucket, they would be, DeAndre Hopkins would be in there. They'd bring back Zeke. They'd be doing all sorts of different things to really kind of push the envelope here for 2023. They're not really doing that. And they kind of drafted with a long-term approach in mind, I think, with some of the way that they conducted themselves. So we have them there. Again, they're towards the bottom of the tier where you can kind of put them in a different area. But that is the second tier. Those are the 5 teams that we have in there. So we have the Chiefs, 49ers, Eagles, Bengals, and Cowboys. And I felt like that you guys are pretty okay with those 5 teams being in there. So we feel pretty comfortable with that. So our next tier, we've got the opening within the next 2 to 4 years on the rise. Taylor B, you'll love this. We got the Jacksonville Jaguars in this tier. We've got the Los Angeles Chargers in this tier. We've got the Detroit Lions in this tier. And we've got the Carolina Panthers in this tier. Those are the 4 teams that we have defined as the championship window opening within the next 2 to 4 years, the teams that are approaching the window, the teams that are on the rise. I think the team that is the most ambitious here is obviously the Carolina Panthers. I very much understand that. I think the other 3, we all agree, I think we're going to agree, Chargers, Jaguars, and Lions belong in this bucket. The Panthers, again, I think are the ambitious one of the group. But I don't think they're in the opening stages of a rebuild. They could be. That feels too much of a slight against them with where I think their roster is at. They're not at a turning point because I don't think they're going to need a reset. They kind of already have done that. And they're not in the other 2 buckets. So this felt like the easiest bucket for them to go into. Bailey says the Chargers might be all in. Williams, Keenan, Mack, all very expensive and running out of their contracts. This might be the last dance with this team. That's fine, Bailey. But long term, they've got Quentin Johnston. They've got Palmer. They've got Herbert. Just because some of the pieces might move around, do you sit here and think that the Los Angeles Chargers, after those guys that you mentioned left, aren't going to be able to be in the mix? I think as long as they have Justin Herbert, they're going to be able to be in the mix. They're not in the firm contender bucket because I do have the same questions that you have about what this supporting cast is going to look like. But as long as you have Justin Herbert, I don't think you can really... And the Bills can't be all in. They have to be firm contenders. They have Josh Allen. But they right now have Josh Allen not on a big-time contract. They have Josh Allen on a big-time contract. The Chargers don't have a big-time contract on Justin Herbert. And they're going to have to do that sometime within the next couple of months. We expect that to happen. I understand your point, and I think this goes back to our Bills conversation from earlier about where we want to put them. If we want to move If we want to move the Bills and the Chargers into the firm contenders bucket because we believe they have their quarterback for a long period of time. But see, then what are we going to do with the Browns? Because the Browns have Deshaun Watson for a long period of time. What's going to be, I'm not asking this rhetorically, this is a philosophical question that I want us to debate right now. What is going to be our differentiating point between the Browns, a team that has their quarterback long term, to the Bills and the Chargers, who we think also have their quarterback long term? Deshaun isn't as good. I don't know if that's a strong enough justification. I don't disagree with you, Taylor B, but I just don't know if that's a strong enough. Also, are the Lions not at a turning point? Clearly, they haven't proven anything and don't have a quarterback answer. This year's make or break for Goff. See, I just disagree with that assertion. I just don't agree. I think Goff will be there for the next couple of seasons. Truly. Allen is the top 3 quarterback. Deshaun isn't. The Browns are spending the most cash this year, pushing contracts back. That would define all in. We think Herbert's a top 10 quarterback. We think Lamar's a top 10 quarterback. And so I think if you have a top 10 quarterback, you kind of sit yourself into the, okay, here, how about this? You have a top 10 quarterback who we think's going to be there long term. Then you get to be a firm contender. That's one of the things that can get you into the firm contender bucket, which is how we can differentiate between the Browns and everybody else. I feel okay with that. I have the phone out. I have the trustee list out. So we're going to remove the Ravens and the Bills. Bailey, hope you're keeping track here. The Ravens and Bills are going to be removed from the all-in. And truly, I don't know if we want to have a ton of teams in the all-in bucket, right? So we're going to put the Buffalo Bills and the Baltimore Ravens into the firm contender bucket. And then we're also adding the Chargers into... Where are we putting the Chargers? We putting the Chargers into the firm contender bucket? I think we are. And then that's what we're going to do with that. And then now our bucket in the opening within the next couple of years is the Jags, Panthers, and Lions. And I will defend the Lions. Chargers shouldn't be in a tier above Jacksonville to me. I don't want to rehash the Trevor Lawrence debate that we constantly always have on this show. But I also kind of don't love having the Chargers and Jags separated. They feel very similarly to me. And I kind of want to move the Chargers back. The Chargers are between firm contender and all in to me. I think they can be. I'd tell it be. So we've got the 4 teams in the all-in bucket: the Jets, Dolphins, Saints, and Browns. We've got our firm contender bucket: the Chiefs, Eagles, Bengals, 49ers, Bills, Ravens, Chargers, Cowboys. And we kind of want to move we want to move the Chargers. And then in our championship window opening within the next 2 to 4 years on the rise, we've got the Jags, Panthers, and Lions. That's currently the way that we have it situated so far with 2 buckets to go. Let's put a pin in this because I feel like we've made some ground, and let's go to the next 2 buckets, and then we'll circle back because we might add more teams into this championship window opening within the next 2 to 4 years, and then we can cycle back. So here are all the teams that I have listed at a turning point bucket: Steelers, Giants, Seahawks. This is where I have the Broncos, Falcons, Patriots, Cardinals, Vikings, Bears. So I'll read those one more time for everybody keeping track at home. The teams that we currently have in the at a turning point bucket, which means they could open their window very shortly or they could need a reset. It's a 50-50 shot, really. Steelers, Giants, Seahawks, Broncos, Falcons, Patriots, Cardinals, Vikings, Bears. That's what we've got for those buckets. I think if you wanted to move a team like the Giants into the on the rise, I wouldn't love it, but I wouldn't hate it. I think the Steelers you can make a similar case for. And I think that's really about it. I feel very strongly about having teams like the Patriots, Cardinals, Vikings, and Bears in this turning point bucket. And then the Falcons are a swingy team. I don't really know what to do with them. And then we've already, aforementioned, talked about what we want to do with the Broncos and potentially have a conversation about them being all in. So that's what we have for the at a turning point bucket. meaning that they could open their championship window right away or they could need a reset. For our last bucket, as I'll let the chat kind of catch up and throw some things in there that we want to discuss, the likely 3 to 4 plus years away, the opening stages of a rebuild, we've got Tampa, Vegas, Green Bay, Tennessee, the Rams, the Commanders, the Texans, and the Colts. Those are the teams that we have in that bucket. Taylor B says the Broncos are all in if the Browns are all in. Okay, I think that's fine. I think we're okay with that. I think we're going to add Denver to that list, and then we'll close that list out. And that tier we can kind of lock in as those 5 teams. And we will remove Denver from the turning point bucket. Now the firm contenders bucket has become our biggest bucket, I think, by sheer volume of teams. But our finalized all-in bucket, the Jets, Dolphins, Saints, Browns, Broncos. Taylor B asks, where are the Falcons? They're currently in the turning point bucket. That's currently where we have them. They're in the turning point bucket with the Steelers, Giants, Seahawks, Patriots, Cardinals, Vikings, and Bears. I think the things that we want to kind of rehash are, do we want to add any more teams into the on the rise bucket? And what we want to do with the Chargers. I think those are our 2 biggest outstanding questions that we have here on the show. Is what we want to do with the Chargers, and if we want to add any team from the turning point bucket, if we think any of those teams are closer to being on the rise than they are to being at a turning point. And I think the 2 teams that you could, 2, maybe 3 teams that you could have a conversation about are the Steelers, the Giants, and the Falcons. I think those are the 3 teams. I think we have too many teams in the firm contenders bucket. I try to keep that bucket small, but we added teams. We added Buffalo, Baltimore, and the Chargers. We moved 3 teams into that bucket. I think the Chargers are the most all-in in the firm contenders. They aren't on the rise. I just don't know if we can classify the Chargers as a all-in team. I just don't know if that fits with our methodology. Steelers might be on the rise just out of respect for Tomlin. You could do that. And Pickett didn't play terrible last year. Pickett was fine. They are choosing one of Mike Williams and Keenan next year. But that's why they drafted Quentin Johnston, right? I just don't know if we can justify making the Los Angeles Chargers a team that we describe as all in. Signing guys like Kendricks on short-term deal. We don't know what the long-term future of Brandon Staley is. All right, let's move the Steelers while I internally try to figure out what we want to do here with the Chargers, who I think are the hardest team to really kind of define. I'm going to move the Pittsburgh Steelers into the outside of Herbert and a few young players. I think the rest of the Chargers franchise is actually at a turning point. So we have now made, and this is why I love doing this with you guys, we have now made the case to put the Chargers in 4 different buckets. We have made the case to put the Chargers in the all-in bucket. We have made the case to put the Chargers in the firm contender bucket. We have made the case to put the Chargers where I currently had them in the on-the-rise bucket. And we just made the case for them to be at a turning point bucket. We have made the case, and I think all of them are reasonable cases. We have made the case to put the Chargers in 4 different buckets. And Heldy says we should make a tier called the Chargers tier. We might need to based on this. Bailey says, I'm happy to have them as firm contenders if you think they are in the middle of the window. I just think they might be approaching the end of this window. They'll get to another one soon with Herbert. And that's kind of why I want to make them a firm contender, Bailey, after considering it. Because to me, being a firm contender means you're going to be able to navigate through some of the rough waters of having a quarterback that's going to make a lot of money because you have a quarterback that's really, really good. And it allows you to kind of, you can kind of navigate through some of this stuff. I think you're right. But I will tell you, Bailey, if we get to the end of the season, right? If we get to the end of the season and they don't play very well and they miss the playoffs and Staley's gone and they have to make all of the overhaul. When we do this list again next year, they're probably going to go to the turning point bucket. And so that's kind of the double-edged sword here of like, I don't know what to do with them. Heldy mentioned just creating a Chargers tier. I feel firm contender. I feel firm contender's fair. I think I'll take the argument. They also have way more pressure on the coaching staff than the other firm contenders, implying the all-in to win bucket. I just don't want to make this a quarterback life cycle instead of a roster life cycle. That's fair, Taylor B. We're not just looking at quarterback. Now, having a quarterback certainly can help you, but you're right. I don't want to completely just put that in. This is the hardest team for us to decide what to do with. I really, truly don't know what to do with them. Because I think we sit here and we view them as a turning point. But when we say turning point, do we really think that they're gonna get to the end of this and need a reset? Is Justin Herbert just gonna be the modern day Matthew Stafford? Where he just was like really, really great for the Lions, but they could never put it together around him? Is that what we're looking at here? Because if that's the case, then the Los Angeles Chargers might be a team that we need to put in the turning point bucket. They definitely aren't on the rise. I think there has been enough questions asked here about what their future looks like to say that they do not have a window that's going to open within the next 2 to 4 years. And there's more questions about 2023 is a true inflection point for them. You know what? They're going in the turning point bucket, guys. They're going in the turning point bucket. I think at the end of the day, we have a lot of questions of whether or not this team is going to look the same in 2024. And when I look at this list, we have it written down here as at a turning point, meaning their championship window could open right away or they could need a reset. I think we got to put them in the turning point bucket. I think we got to do it. They're either in the turning point bucket or they're in the all-in bucket. It's one of the two. Bailey says $60 million over the cap next year. They pushed everything back, kick contracts down the road. Is that not all in? Okay. We're putting them. I've now decided. I put them in the all-in bucket. I don't love it. But Bailey has convinced me because he said they have to win this year or they aren't rebuilding with this GM and head coach. That's by definition all in. And I think I agree with that. And so that's what we're going to do. So we are going to finalize the tiers here because this is one of the longer episodes that we've ever done. So our all-in tier are Jets, Dolphins, Saints, Browns, Broncos, Chargers. Our firm contenders bucket is Chiefs, 49ers, Eagles, Bengals, Cowboys, Bills, Ravens. Our on the rise bucket is Jags, Panthers, Lions, Steelers. Our turning point bucket is Giants, Seahawks, Falcons, Patriots, Cardinals, Vikings, Bears. And our opening stage of rebuild bucket is Bucks, Raiders, Packers, Titans, Rams, Commanders, Texans, Colts. That is what we have as our 2023 NFL championship window tiers list. We've done it, folks. We have gotten through. We have put all 32 teams in a bucket. I don't need to chat. Don't sidebar me with anybody else right now because we went through those last two tiers and nobody said a word. So just because you were distracted by other things doesn't mean that we can. All in doesn't mean that if you screw up, you're going to suck. It just means the people in charge won't survive it. I think that's fair. I think that's a very fair way to look at the way things are going right now. But that is going to do it for us here on the podcast. We've put all 32 teams in a bucket. I need to catch my breath after all the conversation that we just had there and moving all of these teams around. I greatly do appreciate all of you being here. Please rate, review, subscribe, share the podcast. We appreciate you doing all of those things for us. Come on over, join us on the YouTube side of things Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you can catch us on the YouTube side of things. If you're watching us on YouTube, give the video a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. Do all of those things. Helps us out a ton here as we continue to grow the show ahead of the 2023 NFL and college seasons. But that is going to do it for us here on this edition of the podcast. Hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday. Talk with you all tomorrow. Whew. Gotta catch my breath, everybody. Until researching, I didn't realize how desperate the Chargers situation is next year. They won't be adding to this roster next year. They'll be taking big contracts off the books. Yeah, I think ultimately Taylor B made the best point of trying to not make this just about quarterbacks and looking at the big long-term picture. And once you do that, I think the only two buckets you can put the Chargers in are the all-in or the turning point. And then, Bailey, your point about what they've done for this season and that the fact that if they don't win this year, they're more than likely going to make sweeping changes in the front office and with the head coach. That puts them in the all-in bucket. And so I felt pretty comfortable with that justification at the end of the day. But feel pretty good about what we did here, and appreciate all of you helping out, putting this list together. One of our longer shows. I wasn't expecting it to go that long, but it went over a half an hour. So really, really happy about that. A little bit of a shorter pre-show here today, just because we had a longer post-show, I should say, because we had a long pre-show. I've got to edit the show. I got to get it out here relatively quickly. But I appreciate you all being here. We got one more show this week. Tomorrow should be a fun one. Appreciate you all being here. Hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'll talk to y'all later.